Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 20th Century Themed Star Trek Episodes. This video is where I count down my 10 favorite Star Trek episodes that have a 20th century theme to it. I look at episodes from all 5 series, the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. For this video, I'm looking at videos that have a 20th century theme to it, which includes, but is not limited to, episodes where our characters time travel to the 20th century. But it also includes episodes where they visit the 20th century via the holodeck, or have a vision of being in the 20th century, or visit a planet where the inhabitants behave like they're in the 20th century, and also includes episodes where characters from the 20th century are in Star Trek times. I've also decided to include episodes that are 21st century themed, which there are only 2 of, which is why I didn't bother naming this video 20th and 21st century themed episode, because that's a bit of a run-on, but at the same time, it felt silly to exclude these episodes for being in the 21st century, especially the Enterprise episode that takes place in 2001. Just seems silly to leave that out. However, I do not include episodes that have a theme of an earlier century, such as the 19th or 18th century, so this excludes episodes like Time's Arrow and Elementary Dear Data. And as always, I make the final determination on what is a 20th century themed episode, because my videos, my rules. So I came up with a list of 26 eligible episodes, and I did notice that a majority of them weren't all that great. So my top 10 list won't consist of what I would call top-notch episodes, as the first 5 I will mention were probably on the high end of mediocre, but the top 5 is where it gets really good. So like always, I'll start by naming the 5 worst 20th century themed episodes, starting with my number 5, Take Me Out to the Holosuites. This 7th season Deep Space Nine episode sees the Deep Space Nine crew take on a ship of Vulcans in a baseball game, and I not only found this episode ridiculous because I hate sports movies, but also because the whole premise was a bit ludicrous, and the theme of Rom being upset because he sucks and Cisco being a dick because he really wants to win was just dumb. Number 4 on my list is Assignment Earth, the 2nd season original series episode where Kirk and Spock travel back to the 20th century to track an interstellar alien James Bond type spy. This episode was admittedly just a sneaky way for Roddenberry to try to sneak in a pilot for another show idea he had, one which by the way wasn't very good, thus rightfully wasn't picked up. The Star Trek elements seemed tacked on and slim, as the episode mostly followed this James Bond wannabe, thus it was not a very good episode at all. Coming in at number 3 is 1159. This 5th season Voyager episode was about Janeway remembering her ancestors, and we get flashbacks to what her ancestor in 1999 was actually like, and it was nothing like Janeway had been told. This episode was a weak excuse to do an episode set in modern times. The way it tied back into the Voyager storyline was very slim, and the 1999 storyline was cliched and boring, so overall a huge fumble. Number 2 worst episode on my list is Spirit Folk, the 6th season Voyager episode that was a sequel to the horrible episode Fairhaven. This was just a silly holodeck episode about the holodeck characters coming to think that the Starfleet users were demons with magical powers, and despite whatever malfunction excuse they came up with to allow the holodeck characters to see how the users truly are, is ridiculous that they didn't just try to rewrite the holodeck characters, and this whole plot was just silly, poorly executed, making this an absolutely horrible episode. And my number 1 worst 20th century themed episode is Badda-Bing, Badda-Bang. This 7th season Deep Space Nine episode is nothing but an Ocean's 11 ripoff centered around one of the worst characters in all of Star Trek, Vic Fontaine. It was just beyond ridiculous, devoid of originality, and it was just so cliched. This episode was painful to watch and in my opinion represents a low point for all of Star Trek, as it is just a cheap imitation of a popular movie involving a character that never should have existed in the first place, making it my number one worst 20th century themed episode of Star Trek. So, enough of the negativity. Let me get into my best 20th century themed Star Trek episodes, but before I get to my top 10, let me name a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10. First honorable mention is The Big Goodbye, the first season Next Generation episode that shows Captain Picard playing a hard-boiled detective in the 1950s on the holodeck, and when the whole crew joins him, things get a bit hairy when the holodeck, safeties malfunction. Next honorable mention is the Royale, an interesting episode from the second season of The Next Generation that I think is a bit underrated. It gets a lot more slack than I think it deserves. It shows what it's like to be stuck in a poorly written, cheesy noir novel where Riker and his team get stuck in this alien recreation of what they thought human behavior was like by reading a trashy novel about a casino. And my final honorable mention is Bride of Choatica, the 5th season Voyager episode where Tom Paris's holodeck program of a 1940 science fiction schlock becomes crucial in a first contact situation with a photonic alien from another plane of existence that mistake the holodeck program for reality. This was a very hilarious episode, even if the plot was a bit thin and contrived. So now, let me get to my top 10 favorite 20th century episodes of Star Trek, starting with my number 10, A Piece of the Action. This second season original series episode is a fan favorite, and I was never that on board with it, to be honest, as I found the premise about a whole planet of aliens becoming mobsters just because they read a book about Chicago mobsters that was left behind was a bit too ludicrous to get beyond. But this is a really fun episode, and I have to say it was interesting seeing Kirk forced to act like a 1950s style mobster in order to fix cultural damage. So I must admit that this was a very entertaining episode. Number 9 is The Killing Game, the 4th season Voyager 2-parter that sees the Hirogen conquer Voyager and use the holodeck to run some deadly games, which one of them focuses on a World War II scenario of a resistance movement in a small city in France working with American troops to fight off the Nazis. To be honest, I found the plot of this episode to be just a big excuse to have a World War II themed episode. That being said, it was definitely a very intense one, where the storyline of the resistance fighting to win back France mirrored the storyline of Voyager, the crew trying to fight back to win their ship back from the Hirogen, which features some of the most epic battle scenes of the series, so definitely a great episode. Number 8 on my list is our Man Bashir, the 4th season Deep Space Nine episode that was a homage to James Bond, as Bashir plays a secret agent, although never explicitly stated, was obviously modeled after James Bond. And although by this time the whole stuck in a holodeck with the safeties malfunction and was a ridiculously overused and tired tripe, I can't deny this was a very entertaining episode to watch. It was great seeing the unknown visitor have fun playing this typical Bond Russian spy, but more importantly, seeing Avery Brooks' signature overacting put to good use as an over-the-top Bond villain. That was just amazing. And on top of that, seeing Garak and Bashir's relationship grow as Garak gets irritated about how fake this fantasy about being an intelligence agent is compared to his real-life experiences, and seeing Bashir repeat Garak's speech in order to solve their predicament was pretty awesome. Number 7 is The Neutral Zone, the first season Next Generation episode where Data discovers a group of 3 people from the 20th century in cryostasis, so he promptly thaws them so that Dr. Crusher can save their lives, and then hijinks ensue as they have difficulty in assimilating into the 24th century. This episode was basically just a big commentary by Gene Roddenberry about how materialistic and petty our 20th century culture is. I once saw a video on YouTube showing a clip from this episode claiming that Star Trek is communist. That, of course, is very small-minded and a black and white argument, as this episode doesn't promote communism, and it doesn't even necessarily criticize capitalism. Well, okay, it does, but that isn't the main point. The point is to illustrate how petty and primitive it is to have a culture based on acquiring material things, and this was Roddenberry's chance to draw a direct comparison to our culture to his vision of a utopian future where humans overcome things like poverty and war. Many modern day philosophers have commented on how future generations will view this particular aspect of our modern day culture as primitive and barbaric, so it was definitely interesting to see this put in motion and get an outsider's view of our culture as Picard gives some wonderful speeches. Coming in at number 6 is Stormfront, the 4th season Enterprise premiere that showed Archer and crew travel back in time to a World War II era that has been altered by tampering with the timeline, where Germany is invading the United States, aided by an alien faction of the temporal Cold War, where Archer must team up with his longtime adversary Silik in order to fix the timeline. This was a really interesting look at an alternate history, while at the same time finally wrapping up the lingering temporal Cold War storyline. Not one of the best two-parters I've ever seen, but definitely unique as far as time travel episodes go, and it was a complex thrill ride with a lot of moving parts, such as Archer teaming up with loan sharks to fight off aliens, while forming a relationship with the woman he takes to see the ship, while Silik shapeshifts and impersonates officers, and all of this in an alternate history that reminds me of The Man in the High Castle. So definitely a noteworthy episode. Coming in at number 5 is Carpenter Street, the 3rd season Enterprise episode where Archer and T'Pol travel back to 2001 to chase down a group of Xindi attempting to create a bioweapon to destroy humanity in Detroit, Michigan. These Xindi enlist the help of a low-life scum who abducts innocent victims for their experiments, and Archer and T'Pol use him to get to the Xindi. This was a very unique, dark-toned episode that is nothing like Star Trek tends to be, as it features prostitutes getting abducted in the middle of the night by drug addicts, and seeing Archer and T'Pol integrate into this dark world was extremely fascinating and very intense. Number 4 on my list is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Yes, I'm including films in this list because, hey, why not? I mean, this film is such an icon when it comes to 20th century themed Star Trek, I don't know how I could have left it out. This is the film where Star Trek really appealed to a broader audience, and frankly, I put this film right up there with other classic 80s comedies like Ghostbusters, Coming to America, or Crocodile Dundee, as the comedy in this film just comes together perfectly to produce one of the funny Star Trek segments seen on any screen. And it wasn't just funny, it also perfectly tied up the storylines of the 2 previous Star Trek films, as well as presenting some great character stories, such as seeing Spock reintegrate into life after being dead and learning once again who he really is, while on top of that having a pretty suspenseful story about the crew saving Earth from a destructive probe. So don't believe anyone who says this film is just about whales. There's a lot more to it than that. Coming in at number 3 is Past Tense, the 3rd season Deep Space Nine two-parter that uses some of the worst time travel logic I've ever seen on any episode or film or anything, but Otherwise, it is such a fun, suspenseful, intense, and powerful episode that makes important and eerily relevant commentary that's probably more relevant today than it was when this episode airs. I have to overlook the flaws. In this episode, Cisco, Bashir, and Dax find themselves stuck in the early 21st century where they're mistaken for homeless and shuffled away to ghettos for the homeless known as Sanctuary District, where they are inadvertently altered the timeline, which they tried to correct by having Cisco pose as a historical figure who sacrificed himself to end the Sanctuary Districts. This episode eerily predicted that attitudes towards the poor would worsen in the 21st century, although we don't have sanctuary districts yet, but with the political climate being what it is, it wouldn't totally surprise me. Not only that, but seeing Cisco really stick his neck out and go face to face not only with the authorities who try to enforce the sanctuary district, but also with the other rioters who want to kill the hostages. It was a true test of his character while telling a very important and powerfully intense story. Number 2 on my list is Far Beyond the Stars, the 6th season Deep Space Nine episode where Cisco is sent visions by the Prophets, where he is a writer in New York in the 60s who comes up with the idea of Deep Space Nine as a novel. But it is dismissed because it's centered around a black captain. This was a very powerful episode that makes great commentary not just on racial and gender discrimination, but also the power of imagination and perseverance. And it was also great seeing all the main cast out of their makeup playing different roles of the 1960s writers. Truly a unique and great episode. And my number 1 favorite 20th century themed Star Trek episode is City on the Edge of Forever, the first season original Star Trek episode where they encountered a sentient time portal known as the Guardian of Forever, where McCoy, in a drug-induced state, travels back to the past and damages the timeline, so Kirk and Spock travel to 1930 San Francisco to prevent that from happening. But what Kirk needs to do in order to restore the timeline is heartbreaking. Now, those who've seen a lot of my Star Trek Top 10 lists might be sick of seeing this episode at number 1 on a lot of my lists, but it's at number 1 for a good reason, as this was a truly groundbreaking time travel episode that's just as unique and powerful today as it was the day it aired. It's a classic that stands the test of time, making it my number 1 favorite 20th century themed Star Trek episode. So that's it for my top 10 20th century themed Star Trek episodes. Be sure to keep an eye on my channel as I continue to do Star Trek reviews. And I have 2 specific projects to keep an eye out for. One is a live discussion video I'll be doing this weekend with Apkin, Tomko, and Phil the Issues Guy, where we take the 5 highest rated episodes from each of the 5 Star Trek series from IMDb and form our own collective lists on which of these episodes are the best. Join us live in the chat this Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US for this discussion, or if you're watching this video later on, you can check it out in the archives. I'll put a link in the description below. Also, be sure to check out my channel next week, as I'll be doing another Star Trek week where I'll be reviewing 1 episode from each of the 5 Star Trek series with the theme of episodes that I like that everyone else seems to hate. So be sure to check that out. Also, check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Vikings, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.